And I was in Philadelphia for some conference. They asked me to come out and speak, and I gave a talk. And afterwards, somebody came up to me because I'd mentioned working on the Atari 800, and they said, "Have you seen this new book? It's called Racing the Beam." And it's about the Atari 2600, the home console. On the 2600, you have 128 bytes of RAM. 128. Whoa. That's less than one tweet.
Really?
Yes. Less than one tweet of RAM. And so anyway, so this guy at this conference says, "You should read this book." And so I got the book and I was like, holy shit, I can't believe people could even make a game on this machine. It's so limited. So 128 bytes of RAM, 4K. It's hard to even describe it without getting technical, but the bottom line is there's not enough memory to have a memory map display. So any machine after the 2600, there's a place you could store a number in memory and something would show on the screen. Okay, and that's like how you draw stuff on the screen. You store numbers in memory, and things show up on the screen, and then you change them quickly, and then you have a game. The 2600, and this is the reason the book's called Racing the Beam. You have to know where the electron beam is as it scans across the display at all times. That's the way a CRT terminal works. 60 times a second, the electron beam scans all the way across the screen, back and forth, down to the bottom, and then goes back to the top. You have to, in your code, know where that beam is at any time, and you have to change these registers very quickly to get something to show on the screen.
You're turning a flashlight on and off as it's being waved in front of somebody's face.
That's exactly. That's a great way to say it. And you're running on a 6502, which is a very old, very slow microprocessor. There's only 76 clock cycles for the time that the electron beam goes across the screen once and then comes back. Every assembly instruction takes anywhere from 2 to 6 clock cycles. So you're going to get maybe 20 assembly instructions every time the line goes across. And these are, I mean, for people who, I'm sure nobody in the audience knows at this point, but like an assembly instruction is like add two 8-bit numbers together, add two numbers from 0 to 255, store the result in this location.
Yeah, really basic.
Right. So you have a tiny amount of memory to work with. You have a larger but still very small, like 4K, 4,000 bytes is like a page and a half of text. 128 bytes is like one tweet. And you have a very slow machine where you have to do things very quickly. So that's why if you're into this stuff, like if you make games, it's really fun to read this book, Racing the Beam. And so
I got to write that down. I got to check it out.
Yeah, Ian Bogost and Nick Montfort are the two authors.
Cool title.
Yeah. So anyway, I read this book, and I'm like, wow, this is way worse than I thought it would be. I wonder if I could make something, if I could play with it a little. So I looked online, and there was actually a little emulator debugger that some fans had set up, and I'm like, okay, I just want to get one thing on the screen. And that took me about a month just to get, but what one thing should I make? And so I opened up Paint and I started to play, and we established before, I'm not very creative at this stuff, so I'm like, okay, I'm just going to draw an 8-bit version of the Master Chief. So I just went in Paint, and I did a little pixel drawing of a little 8-bit, he's 8 pixels wide, right? Could
green.
Be a little taller, made him green, have a little yellow mask. And, anyway, so a month later, I have that on the screen. And then over the next couple of months, I make it so he can run around. He's got a little 2 animations, swaps between. And then I gave him a gun so he could shoot. And then I made a little enemy and then I made it so the enemy could shoot back. So, and then I was pretty much done. I was like, okay, that was fun. And I go to GDC in March 2010. And I'm walking through the expo floor, and I happen to run into some guys from the game business, Chris Charla, Mike Micah. For people who don't know, Mike Micah runs a company called Other Ocean. It was just acquired by Atari, actually, and they did a lot of retro stuff. And I've known these guys over the years. Chris Charla, for people who don't know, runs ID at Xbox, the Xbox indie stuff for the last many years. But they're standing there with Ian Bogost, one of the authors of the book, and a couple guys, like the guy who wrote Pac-Man for the 2600, whose name I'm spacing on, and another 2600 programmer from back in the day. Like, these guys, I now appreciate that these guys are like gods among men, because I'm a pretty hotshot programmer, and I'm like, oh,
I mean, all those fish. Yeah.
I mean, I wrote 6502 games for the 800. I mean, you know, that's not that easy to do. But anyway, but this is like a whole nother level, you know. So I'm talking about, I'm like, wow, this is such a coincidence. I'm like, I read your book, you know, it's awesome. I've been playing on the, you know, this 2600 emulator. I can't believe what you guys accomplished. And they're like, well, what are you doing with it? And I'm like, oh, I just made a little Master Chief so I could just see, you know, have him running around. And Chris Charlie looks at me, so he's like, you're making Halo for the 2600? And I'm like, no, I'm not making Halo for the 2600. It's just a little like tech demo. And then Mike is like, you got to do it. And I'm like, I got to do what? And they're like, Charlie's like, you got to finish the game. You know, it's like, you got to finish the game, man. I'm like, it's not even a game. It's like, no, you got to finish it. It's a moral imperative. And I'm like, you know, and I'm like, how do I get out of this? I'm like, oh, you know, I'm not really that good at this, you know, pixel art. And Mike is like, I'll draw your pixel art. And then the other guys are like, we'll be your testers, you know. And then they're like, they like make this whole decision. And I'm like, wait, you know, for me, for the next 6 months of my life. Anyway, so I walk out of GDC with no choice but this, you know, commandment to actually turn this into a real game. And so I, you know, like, what am I going to do? And so I was basically like, well, I love the, you know, adventure back in the game where you move from room to room.
Oh, yeah.
2600. And I'm like, what if I combine sort of Halo with adventure? And anyway, and it was this whole long, difficult, super fun process. I've given whole talks on this, but yeah, and I got it done in time for a Classic Gaming Expo in Vegas that summer, so it was about 6 months start to finish, which was typical of the development times in the old days for these games. And I really got to experience, I mean, by the last couple months, I'm like completely out of RAM, completely out of ROM, and I'm not done. And every time I go to change something, I have to go back and rewrite some routines to find a few more bytes so I can put them, you know, somewhere else. And it was just like, I mean, once you've rewritten the same routine 6 or 7 times, you're like, what? Last time I thought I had taken everything out of this and I got to look at it again. There's a kind of a weird beauty to it. It's just kind of hard to describe. It's like everything is like at its limit. And you see some of the tricks that people have developed over the years where, like, who needs a stack? You point the stack pointer at these control registers, and then you save a few bytes because you're just pushing stuff onto the stack, but you're really changing these control registers that make the sprites be in the right place. And it's like, if you didn't have that trick, there's no way you could get it done in the 20 instructions that you had. You're like,
I think all the older listeners, the younger listeners, their eyes just glazed over.
Yeah, we've lost them all. But anyway, the point is, I shipped the game. It's out there. It's a real 2600 game.
Can we download the ROMs?
Well, it's physical, right? It's
yeah,
like a physical copy.
Yeah. So they were selling physical copies up until Atari bought the Atari Age website, and then Atari got nervous about whether they'd get sued by Microsoft around the Halo IP rights. So it's not for sale right now, but you can easily find a ROM image for it.